what kind of got you into drumming, and what were you listening to as a youngster then? Because obviously the styles that you've worked with since are very diverse. So what was it that got you into drumming, and what sort of music styles did you like when you were younger?
I was brought up in the jazz world. My father was was known for being a clarinetist. His name was Sid Phillips, and he had a Dixieland band, and for many years, actually, his first band he formed actually in 1925 was called the Melodians. So really, pretty much the start of jazz in the UK,
Yeah,
definitely.
wow.
Um, and he did, I mean, all sorts of stuff. He did a lot of arranging for big bands. One of them being Bert Ambrose. He went to New York, worked with Paul Whiteman, did his arrangements. He had a radio show with I can't remember which radio station it was, but one of the New York stations. Really, up until we had the Second World War, and of course was very patriotic, so he came back and immediately joined up and served 6 years in the RAF.
Wow.
And he didn't do any music through that time. He totally put it aside and said, I'm working for my country now. So don't ask me what he did. I have no idea. It's still secret.
Wow.
So apparently, yeah. Um, I mean, he could have been changing wheels on a Lancaster. I don't know. But no, he was in intelligence. So anyway, as soon as the war finished, he got back to music and formed his own band and was very, very well known in the UK throughout the 50s. And I came along in 1957, and he used to rehearse the band at the house. And I think from 0 to 3 years old, it didn't make too much of an impression. Certainly not from the drum kit, but the lovely shiny horns, the tenor and the baritone, the alto were like, oh wow. And then of course the noise they made, that's the other thing, it was like, you know. But one day in 19, I guess it must have been 1960. It was in my third year. Um, he had a new drummer. It was his first rehearsal with the band, and he also kind of changed the setup. So if you walked into the living room, bang, there was the band, and there was the drum kit, a beautiful Ludwig, super classic drum kit, four-piece kit with a bright, shiny snare drum, chrome. And of course, I was, 3 years tall, if you know what I mean, looking up at the hi-hats going like this, and the kick pedal going like this, and the sound of this snare drum. And he was also a wonderful drummer. His name was Dave Rogers. And I have all this to blame him. I blame him for all this. And that was it. From that moment on, although I didn't know it at the time, I knew what I was going to do for the rest of my life.
Wow. I love hearing stories like that. So obviously your dad's background and everything like that was with jazz. So was jazz your first love?
Yes, I grew up. Like the first rhythm I learned to play was basically a straight ahead triplet style rhythm, typical of more Dixieland, so more Gene Krupa like. Definitely where Louis Bellson, Buddy Rich,
Yeah.
Chick Webb, where they all started from, which is that Chicago type Dixieland, four on the floor, four on the kick, um, very very straight, but with the groove. That's the thing. It's finding the subtlety of that triplet ride cymbal rhythm. So that's where I started, and a shuffle, of course. Those are the two main rhythms, and that's what I grew up with. So jazz was very very big on my horizon. My mother was a huge jazz fan, and that's how she met my dad. And she was a big fan of Count Basie, um, Benny Goodman, and that's what I grew up in the house. That's what was there. It was my dad's music as well. Loads of 78s, shellac, and but I also had I had two elder brothers, half brothers, and they were into rock and roll. So I was also hearing the Beatles when they started, the Rolling Stones when they started, Cliff Richard and the Shadows, uh, Bill Haley, of course, had the 78s. So it was a mixture of early rock and roll and jazz, but my parents could not stand rock and roll. So it was not allowed to be played kind of when they were present, only when they were busy doing something. So I had I'd play along, when I was old enough to have something to hit, and that was it. Yeah. So the big grounding in jazz. Yeah.
So when you say there when you're old enough to hit, I mean, when did you first start playing in groups and in bands?
Oh, well, my dad didn't want me to be a musician. That was quite obvious, but my mom did. Um, and at that time, I had a snare drum and a cymbal. That's all I had. Um, the interesting thing was I was having piano lessons, but the teacher, of course, this is, in the early 60s, she was trying to teach me, like a C major triad and C major scales. My brain was already used to complex jazz harmony. It was the most boring shit I'd ever heard was, a C major triad. And so I just kept looking at my little snare drum and cymbal, because if I could play drums, I just put the records on. So I hear all this wonderful music. If she had shown me a G sus4 chord, I would have loved piano, would have loved to have learned it. But I wasn't old enough to know the how to do that. So I had no interest in learning, some classical type piano. I wanted to get on the drum kit so I could hear great music. That was kind of more where I was at, and playing along to these records. So my dad decided when I was 6 years old to see if I really had any worthwhile talent. He set me the task of learning two of his songs, and then I used to go to sessions with him. So I was being dragged around BBC studios from when I was tiny. So, which was amazing to have that experience, the discipline of sitting in a seat as a 5-year-old and not making a noise because the red light's on. I mean, it's quite interesting how that's hard for a 5-year-old to do.
Yeah,
But I
absolutely.
mean, I would have been hung, drawn, and quartered if I opened a sweet wrapper, thrown out on the M1, So the idea was at the end of the broadcast, I was to play two songs and record two songs with his band. So I still have the recording.
Oh, wow.
It's hilarious. But the thing is, I got through it. I didn't make too many mistakes. I started with the band. I finished with the band, So I memorized the song because I couldn't read music at that stage. I'd memorized the two songs. They were recorded. And that's when he said, "Oh dear, I think he's going to be a musician." So and then I started sitting with the band occasionally on gigs when I was 8 years old.
Oh my word.
Until I joined the band when I was 12, mainly because his style of music, it was quite old fashioned, and nobody in London wanted to play like that anymore. All the drummers wanted to play like Elvin Jones and Roy Haynes, and they didn't want to play this trad style. I grew up with it. It was second nature to me. I couldn't play anything else. Well, a little bit, but that was ingrained in me. And even though I was incredibly inexperienced, dynamics, I'm playing as loud as I can. It's but from his point of view, even though it was raw and it was inexperienced, I had good time. And whenever I did drift, he was really on my case. And I could read by then. I could read the charts and I could play the style. And for him, it was just like, finally, I've got a drummer that knows how to play this style. And which is pretty amazing to be entrusted in a band where the youngest guy was 30 years old and going up to 60. By that time, he was 60. When I joined the band, he was 61. So, and the other guys were all 60, 50, 40. And they changed too, because in those days you just forget, you ring up and you find who's available, and off you go. So I was traveling up and down the British Isles every weekend for 2 or 3 shows, and then skiving off school. And school was a problem. I had to find a place that would accept the fact that I was already earning a living. And that was the other thing. I was already earning a living at 12 years old. So it was, I mean, when I look back at it now and I look at a 12-year-old, I go, how was that even possible? But it happened, and it was the most amazing apprenticeship anyone could ever have.
It's absolutely fascinating as well to, like you say, to think that at such a young age you had such abilities to be able to comprehend being in a band situation and performing in front of people and everything like that. It's staggering, really.
Yeah, but you see, children are very they're sponges, and they can adapt so quickly, much quicker than adults. And it's interesting. I mean, what I learned was musical discipline. He was very tough. He was not from the Victorian era, but he was from the 20s and 30s. I mean, and very strict. And I mean, at times, especially when I was getting older and growing my hair and playing along to Blood, Sweat and Tears in Chicago and wanting to play rock and roll, which he hated, it got quite tense, and sometimes the band had to kind of have a chat with him, say you're a little bit too rough with him. So but as a child, I was told this many years later by some of the band members. I didn't even realize it at the time, because children don't. It's the norm. So interesting. Yeah, because and I think of it more now as a 66-year-old than I have more than any other time in my life.
Yeah, I can imagine. Absolutely. So when did you make the move away from working with your dad's group and begin working with other groups? And because you did a lot of recording, didn't you? So when did that happen?
So I was in this band for 4 years. 1973, I think it was May. Yeah, it was May. He died very suddenly, so that kind of put everything on hold, and I was kind of basically faced with the question of, what do you want to do? Do you want to continue the band? Well, by that time, the last thing I wanted to play was jazz. I wanted to get into rock and roll. I'd already started doing recording sessions with him, so I was starting to I've already had my first few experiences of playing in the studio. And I'd also was starting to play with other band leaders, still playing dance music, basically, bow tie, suit. But that's not what I wanted to do. And so I said no. But the other reason was I'm a purist, and without him, his way of playing, his tone was very, very special. It was not the Benny Goodman tone at all. It was more Artie Shaw. It was a beautiful tone. I mean, really, and nobody would have been able to fill that spot. And it just would have been, the Sid Phillips band B, Yeah. And I just, even at that age, I knew this is not going to work. So, I had to disband the band, and suddenly I was out of work. But I got a break. I did a few gigs, like dance band gigs, and it kind of fizzled out, really. And I got my first straight job, working in a hi-fi store, which was wonderful because I was really into hi-fi, and my mom had quite a rig, and so I used to, anybody that came in for like Hoover bags, I tried to sell them a hi-fi system, only because I wanted to go and set it up for them. I did sell a few, but I wasn't very good at that, So I think I sold. You know who Lionel Blair was?
Oh yes, yeah, yeah. Tap
I
dancer.
sold his wife a washing machine once.
Okay.
um, so anyway, and then I got a call from the contractor of a West End show called Jesus Christ Superstar that was into just had just finished its first year or coming up to its first year. Would I like to audition for the show? I went, oh wow, yeah. So he said, right, where do you live? And I gave him my address. And he said, right, I'll drop the charts round. And he knocks on the door, and I open the door, and he looks at me, he goes, are you Simon? I said, yeah. He said, can you read music? Oh, yeah. Okay. And he gave me this big pad of music, which is the show for Jesus Christ Superstar. I said, thanks. He said, right. And he told me the date of the audition. And I said, right, I'll be there, Palace Theatre, 10 o'clock in the morning, whatever, went out and got the record, of Jesus Christ Superstar, and started going through the charts. And what had happened was one of the keyboard players, Dave Collin, used to play in my dad's band. Okay. And he was so encouraging and helpful. He used to bring LPs and lend them to me. He lent me Chick Corea, Now He Sings, Now He Sobs, Don Ellis, Stan Kenton. I mean, he really was the guiding light to get me into that kind of music. And they were looking for a new drummer, and he put my name forward. He said, he's really young, but he can do the gig, which was really amazing. And I turned up, and people in the business, musician, had already heard of me. They'd already heard, check out, Sid Phillips on, he's playing blah, 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 So it wasn't totally alien to them. They had heard, but they hadn't played with me yet. Actually, I think I met a couple of the musicians that were playing there on a session once, but I wasn't playing. I just was brought along to it. And we did the audition, and they said, all right, we'll let you know. And I'm like this. And I got the call a few hours later. You've got the gig. So that was really the start of my professional career outside of my father. And in those days, you didn't have drum machines, you didn't have sequencers. If you wanted to make a demo, you had to hire musicians, and you had to hire a cheaper studio, usually a 4-track or maybe an 8-track. And at that point, studios were just starting to get delivery. This is 1973 of 24-track machines, but most studios were still 16-track at that point. So somebody in the Jesus Christ Superstar cast would ask me, "Do you want to come do a demo with me?" Sure, yeah. And so I'd be booked for that date, and then I'd turn up, and the other musicians, of course, much older than me, and they go, "Okay," and I play the track, and they go, "Hey, give me a number," and that's how it happened. It was like a chain effect. And suddenly the bass player, and I remember John Prizeman, I think that might be his name. I may be wrong, and I remember he got my number, then he called me for another session. So now I'm doing another session with so many people I don't know every single, not every day, but almost every day. That's what it turned into when I had to buy another drum kit, because I couldn't keep taking my kit out of the Palace Theatre every time I had a session. It was very tricky, to get it up on the stage, and so yeah, that's how it started.
Fantastic stuff.